Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The call came through dispatch at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in August. I'd been cruising down Shea Boulevard in my patrol car, windows down because the AC was struggling against the Arizona heat. 3 months out of the academy, and I was still getting used to the weight of the badge on my chest. Jennifer Blake, that's me, and I was the only unit available in the Northeast sector when Nancy's voice crackled through the radio. Unit 4827, we've got multiple reports of screaming from 8425 East Monterey Way. Neighbors say it's been going on for about 10 minutes. I remember thinking it was probably just another domestic dispute, the kind where couples got too loud after too many beers. In this part of Scottsdale, with its cookie-cutter stucco houses and pristine desert landscaping, that was usually the worst thing that happened. The neighborhood was one of those newer developments where every house had the same terracotta roof tiles and beige exterior walls. As I turned onto Monterey Way, I killed the headlights and rolled up slowly, just like they taught us. The street was dead quiet, which immediately struck me as wrong. Usually when neighbors call about screaming, you can still hear something when you arrive, arguing, crying, maybe a TV turned up too loud. But here, nothing. Just the distant hum of AC units and the chirping of crickets. The house at 8425 sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, porch light off, looking exactly like every other house except for one thing. The front door was hanging open about 6 inches, swaying slightly in the breeze. I radioed in my arrival and grabbed my flashlight, that heavy mag light that could double as a weapon if needed. The concrete of the driveway was still radiating heat from the day, and I could feel sweat already forming under my vest. I approached the front door, announcing myself loudly. "Scottsdale Police! Anyone home?" My voice echoed strangely in the quiet night, bouncing off the neighboring houses. No response. I pushed the door open wider with my flashlight and saw the first sign that this wasn't a typical domestic call. The entryway table was overturned, a ceramic vase shattered across the tile floor, and there were dark smears on the wall, maybe blood, maybe something else. The house smelled wrong too, like copper pennies mixed with something chemical I couldn't place. Every instinct told me to wait for backup, but protocol said to check for anyone who might need immediate help. I clicked my radio again. "Dispatch, I've got signs of forced entry and possible struggle at the residence, requesting backup." Nancy's voice came back immediately. "Copy that, 4827. Closest unit is about 12 minutes out." 12 minutes. In a situation like this, that might as well have been an hour. The living room was to my right, and I could see the glow of a television casting shifting blue light across the walls. I swept my flashlight across the hallway first, clear, then moved toward the living room, my free hand resting on my service weapon. That's when I saw them. The whole family was there, a man, a woman, and 2 kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were all on the floor, hands zip-tied behind their backs, duct tape across their mouths. The woman's eyes went wide when she saw me, and she started making these desperate muffled sounds, shaking her head violently. At first I thought she was just scared, traumatized by whatever had happened. But then I realized she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, toward the darkened hallway I'd just come from. The man was doing it too, his eyes practically bulging as he tried to communicate something through the tape. That's when it hit me. They weren't relieved to see a cop, they were terrified. And they were trying to warn me about something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway was empty, but now I noticed things I'd missed before. There were more of those dark smears on the walls, and the family photos that lined the hallway were askew, like someone had brushed against them while moving through. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged in the silence. I drew my weapon, keeping it pointed down but ready. "Police, if anyone's in this house, make yourself known now." My voice cracked on the last word, betraying my fear. Behind me, the family's muffled sounds grew more frantic. The little girl was crying, tears streaming down her face, and her brother had scooted himself behind the couch, trying to hide. These weren't people who'd just been robbed. They were people who knew their attackers were still here, waiting. I had to make a choice. Every second I spent frozen in that living room was another second the perpetrators had to position themselves, maybe even escape. But I couldn't leave this family tied up and helpless either. I holstered my weapon momentarily and knelt beside the woman, pulling out my knife to cut the zip ties. "How many?" I whispered as I worked on her restraints. "How many are in the house?" As soon as I freed her hands, she ripped the tape off her mouth, gasping. "Two," she choked out, her voice hoarse. "Two men. They said they weren't done yet. Said they were waiting for—" A floorboard creaked somewhere above us. We all heard it. The woman grabbed my arm with both hands, her nails digging into my skin. "They're upstairs," she breathed. "In my daughter's room. They were looking for something, tearing everything apart. Please, please don't let them." Another creak, this one closer to the stairs. I clicked my radio as quietly as I could. "Dispatch, I need that backup now. 2 suspects still in the house. Family is secure, but—" The lights went out. Complete darkness. The kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The TV had shut off too, which meant they'd killed the power at the breaker. My flashlight was the only source of light now, creating harsh shadows that danced across the walls. The woman's grip on my arm tightened to the point of pain. "Get your family out," I hissed at her. "Out the front door now. Run to a neighbor's house and don't stop." She hesitated for maybe half a second before scrambling to free her husband and kids. I could hear them fumbling in the dark, the children whimpering as I positioned myself between them and the staircase. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, trying to cover too much space at once. Every shadow could hide a person. Every corner could conceal a threat. The family stumbled past me toward the front door, and I heard it slam open against the wall. Good. At least they were out. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Not trying to be quiet anymore. Heavy boots, deliberate and slow. First one set, then another. They were coming down together. I backed up, keeping my weapon trained on the staircase, flashlight held alongside it like they'd taught us at the range. "Police! Stop where you are and show me your hands!" My voice echoed in the empty house. The footsteps paused, and then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Laughter. Low, amused chuckling from 2 different voices. "Well, well," a man's voice drifted down from the darkness. "Looks like we got ourselves a baby cop. All alone, too. Your backup's still about 8 minutes out, sweetheart. We've been listening to your radio." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure they could hear it. 8 minutes. They knew exactly how long I had to survive. The footsteps resumed, getting closer. I could see shadows moving at the top of the stairs now, just outside my flashlight's reach. I made a tactical decision that probably saved my life. Instead of holding my ground like some action movie hero, I moved, fast. I ducked into the kitchen, using the walls for cover, trying to put distance and obstacles between me and them. The kitchen had a back door. I could see it across the room, moonlight filtering through its window. But leaving meant abandoning my position, potentially letting these men escape to hurt someone else. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. "Where'd you go, officer?" The second voice was different, younger, more aggressive. "We just want to talk. See, we've got a problem. That family saw our faces. You've seen us too, haven't you? Can't have that." I heard them split up. One set of footsteps headed toward the living room, the other toward the kitchen, toward me. I crouched behind the island, trying to control my breathing. The man entered the kitchen slowly, and I could see his silhouette. Tall, bulky, something in his hand that wasn't a gun. A knife, maybe, or a crowbar. He was 3 feet away when my radio crackled to life. "Unit 4827, backup is 5 minutes out. What's your status?" The sudden noise in the quiet house made us both jump. He spun toward my hiding spot, and I saw his face clearly in my flashlight beam for the first time. Mid-30s, scarred cheek, wild eyes, and definitely a crowbar in his hand. Time slowed down. I saw him raise the crowbar, saw him take that first step toward me. My training kicked in. "Drop the weapon!" I shouted. But he kept coming. The space was too tight, too close for what happened next. I fired twice center mass, just like they taught us. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. He dropped immediately, the crowbar clattering across the tile floor. My ears were ringing and I could smell gunpowder and blood, but I couldn't focus on what I'd just done because his partner was screaming from the other room, not in fear or surprise, but in rage. Pure, animalistic fury. "You killed him. You fucking killed him." The voice was getting closer and I could hear him crashing through furniture, no longer caring about stealth. I ran for the back door, fumbling with the lock in the dark. My flashlight had rolled somewhere during the shooting, leaving me in near total darkness. Behind me, the second man burst into the kitchen. I could hear him stumble over his partner's body, cursing. The lock finally gave way and I shouldered through the door into the backyard. The desert air hit me like a wall, still thick with heat. I sprinted across the yard, vaulting over a low fence into the neighbor's property. I could hear him behind me, boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. "I'm gonna kill you," he screamed. "You hear me? You're dead." I cut between houses, trying to circle back to the street where my patrol car was parked. I needed to get to my radio, to update dispatch, to do something other than run. But he was faster than me, or maybe just more desperate. I could hear him gaining ground. Then sirens. Beautiful, wonderful sirens. Multiple units converging on the neighborhood. The sound seemed to break something in my pursuer. I heard his footsteps falter, then stop completely. When I finally made it back to the street, half a dozen patrol cars were screeching to a halt, officers pouring out with weapons drawn. They found the second suspect 2 hours later, hiding in a drainage tunnel about a mile away. Turned out they were brothers, wanted for a string of home invasions across 3 states. They'd been looking for a specific family, something about an old drug debt the father had tried to leave behind when he moved to Arizona. The family was okay, traumatized but physically unharmed. They'd made it to safety thanks to those crucial seconds I'd bought them. The man I shot didn't make it. First time I'd ever fired my weapon outside the range. First time I'd taken a life. The investigation cleared me. Justified use of force, they said. But I still think about that night sometimes, about how different it could have gone if I'd waited for backup like I was supposed to. Maybe both suspects would be alive and in custody. Or maybe that family would be dead, and me along with them. 3 years later, I'm still a cop, but I'm not a rookie anymore. I train the new ones now, and I always tell them the same thing. The badge doesn't make you invincible. Sometimes the best thing you can do is survive long enough for help to arrive. And always, always trust your gut when it tells you something's wrong. Because in this job, the difference between going home and not going home can be as simple as recognizing that moment when the victims aren't relieved to see you. They're warning you that the danger is still there, waiting in the dark. The night shift at dispatch was usually quiet in our small Colorado town, especially during those cold February nights in 2018. I'd been working as a 911 operator for about 3 years by then, living alone in a studio apartment near the station, because the irregular hours made it easier than commuting from the suburbs. Most nights, I'd handle maybe 2 or 3 calls, usually drunk drivers, domestic disputes, or the occasional medical emergency. Nothing that really stuck with you after clocking out. I was 28, still figuring out if this career was what I wanted long term. But the pay was decent, and I felt like I was actually helping people. That particular night started like any other. Me settling into my chair with a fresh cup of coffee, adjusting my headset and preparing for another 8 hours of relative monotony. Around 2:47 a.m., a call came through that immediately felt different. The caller ID showed it was coming from a payphone on Maple Street, down in the industrial district where most of the old factories had been shuttered for decades. That alone was strange. I didn't even know we still had working payphones in town. The voice on the other end was an elderly man, probably in his 70s or 80s, and he was breathing hard, almost wheezing between words. "Please, please help me," he gasped, and I could hear genuine terror in his voice. "I'm at 1847 Industrial Way, apartment 3B. Someone's trying to break in. They've been pounding on my door for 20 minutes. I think they're going to get through." His voice cracked on that last part, and I could hear what sounded like heavy banging in the background, rhythmic and relentless. I immediately dispatched 2 units to the address while keeping the man on the line, following protocol. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Officers are on their way." "What's your name?" There was a pause filled only with that awful banging sound and his labored breathing. "Harold. Harold Brennan," he finally managed. "They won't stop. Oh God, they won't stop knocking." The way he said knocking sent chills through me. It was like he was describing something far worse than just someone at his door. I tried to keep him talking, asking about exits, if he had somewhere safe to hide, but his responses were becoming more fragmented. "The walls, they're moving with each knock, like breathing. Can't you hear it through the phone?" I couldn't, but I assured him help was almost there. The connection was terrible, crackling with static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the banging he described. Officers Mitchell and Vasquez radioed in that they were approaching the building. It was one of those old converted factory complexes, turned into low-income housing back in the 90s. Most of the units were vacant now, the whole area practically abandoned after the recession hit. I relayed this to Harold, telling him they were just minutes away, but he'd gone quiet except for his ragged breathing. Then suddenly he spoke again, his voice different somehow, calmer but infinitely more disturbing. "They're inside now," he whispered. "They're inside, but I can't see them. The air tastes like copper pennies, just like before, when Mom died." "Do you taste it too?" I was trying to make sense of his words when the line went completely dead, not just disconnected, but dead in a way that left my ears ringing with silence. Mitchell's voice crackled through the radio about 5 minutes later. "Dispatch, we're at apartment 3B, doors locked, no response to our knocks, no sounds of disturbance." I told them about the call, the panic in Harold's voice, the claim that someone had broken in. They decided to force entry for a welfare check. I heard the splintering of wood through their radio, then silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. When Mitchell came back on, his voice was strained, professional, but clearly shaken. "We need the coroner out here. Elderly male, deceased. Been dead a while from the looks of it." My stomach lurched. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. There was a pause before Vasquez took over the radio. "Body's in full rigor, room temperature. We're looking at least 24 hours, maybe more." The rest of my shift blurred together as detectives arrived at the scene and I had to replay the call for investigation purposes. But the real nightmare began when Detective Brooks called me into the station the next evening. He had that look cops get when something doesn't add up and they don't like it. "We need to talk about that payphone," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Inside were photos of the phone booth on Maple Street, rusted, graffiti-covered, with wires hanging loose from where they'd been cut. "This phone hasn't been operational since 2014. Phone company confirmed it. No power, no connection, nothing." I stared at the photos, my mind refusing to process what he was saying. "But I got a call. I have the recording. The caller ID showed that number." Brooks nodded slowly. "We know. We heard the recording. Crystal clear, which is another problem. That model of payphone, even when it worked, had terrible audio quality. Your recording sounds like it came from a modern phone." Things got worse when Brooks pulled up the surveillance footage. The city had installed cameras at that intersection 2 years ago after a series of break-ins. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., the exact time I received the call. The payphone booth was clearly visible, illuminated by a flickering streetlight. Nobody was there. Not a soul approached that booth for the entire hour before and after the call. We watched it 3 times. Brooks even slowed it down frame by frame. The booth remained empty, its broken door hanging open, the receiver dangling from its severed cord like a hanged man. This has to be some kind of technical glitch, I insisted, but even I could hear how desperate I sounded. Brooks wasn't done. He pulled out another file, this one thicker. Harold Brennan's phone records, he said. His landline in the apartment. Want to guess the last call he made? It was to 911, of course, but here's where my skin really started to crawl. Harold had called emergency services at 11:23 p.m. the night before he died, roughly 27 hours before I received his call from the payphone. Brooks played that recording for me, and I immediately recognized the voice, though it was calmer, more coherent. This is Harold Brennan at 1847 Industrial Way, apartment 3B. I'm having chest pains and difficulty breathing. I think I'm having another heart attack. The dispatcher on duty that night had sent an ambulance, but Harold had called back 5 minutes later to cancel it, saying he felt better and just needed to rest. That was his last contact with anyone. The coroner determined he'd died of a massive cardiac event sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. When I did the math, my mouth went dry. He'd been dead for at least 24 hours when I got that impossible call from the broken payphone. Brooks let me process this information while he pulled up more files on his computer. We interviewed the neighbors, what few are left in that building. The unit below Harold's has been empty for 6 months. The one next door is occupied by a woman named Gladys Turner. She's 73, nearly deaf, but she remembered something interesting. He showed me the interview transcript. Gladys had told officers that she'd heard banging from Harold's apartment 2 nights ago, the night he died. She'd assumed he was hanging pictures or moving furniture, though she'd thought it was odd given the late hour. The banging had gone on for about 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The timeline matched up with Harold's first 911 call. So he was having a heart attack, possibly stumbling around, hitting the walls, I said, trying to rationalize it. Brooks gave me a look that said he wasn't buying it either. Maybe, but that doesn't explain your call, does it? The technical team had been over our system 3 times. There was no hack, no spoofing, no rational explanation for how that call had come through. The recording was authentic, time-stamped, logged in our system like any other call. But it was impossible. I'd spoken to a dead man through a disconnected phone. Brooks showed me one final piece of evidence that made my blood turn to ice water. They'd gone through Harold's apartment thoroughly, documenting everything. On his kitchen table, they'd found a notepad where he apparently wrote reminders to himself. The last entry, in shaky handwriting, was dated the night he died. Called 911, canceled ambulance. Better to go quietly. Strange dreams lately. Mom's voice. She says the phone will ring when it's time. I stared at those words until they blurred. Brooks closed the file. We're ruling it as a technical anomaly. No crime was committed. Harold died of natural causes. But between you and me? He leaned forward. I've been a cop for 20 years, and this is the thing that's going to keep me up at night. I tried to go back to work to pretend everything was normal, but every time a call came in, especially late at night, I'd check the caller ID with growing dread. I lasted 2 more weeks before I couldn't take it anymore. The final straw came when I was walking past that payphone booth on my day off. I'd deliberately gone out of my way to see it, to convince myself it was just a broken relic. As I stood there staring at it in the dim afternoon light, the severed receiver suddenly swayed in the wind, and for just a second, I could swear I heard a dial tone coming from it. I put in my notice the next day, moved to Oregon, got a job at a call center selling insurance. Nice, normal, boring work where the living call to complain about premiums and coverage, not the dead calling for help that comes too late. I still think about Harold Brennan sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the phone rings unexpectedly. I think about him dying alone in that apartment, choosing to wave off the ambulance, accepting his fate. But mostly I think about that 20-minute gap, the banging his neighbor heard, the terror in his voice when he called me a full day after his death. Was he trying to change his mind? Was something trying to save him? Or was something else entirely trying to get in? I'll never know. The building was demolished 6 months later for a shopping complex that never got built. The payphone was removed too, sold for scrap. But sometimes in my dreams, I still hear that banging, rhythmic and relentless, and Harold's voice asking if I can taste the copper pennies. I always wake up before I can answer, my mouth full of that metallic taste, reaching for a phone that isn't ringing. Officer Thompson here. 6 years on the force patrolling the suburban beats in Washington state. I've handled plenty of domestic calls during my time, usually shouting matches that settle down once we arrive, or someone who's had too much to drink and needs to cool off elsewhere for the night. But this particular call from last September, a Thursday evening around 7:30 p.m., still haunts me. I was partnered with Officer Davis that shift, seasoned cop with 12 years under his belt, the kind of backup any officer wants in a tough situation. We had just finished our patrol route through the Maple Heights neighborhood when dispatch crackled through our radio with what appeared to be a standard domestic disturbance call on Elm Street. The address was 1247 Elm Street, a quiet residential area where the biggest problems were usually noise complaints or minor traffic violations. The house appeared completely normal when we pulled up. White picket fence, well-maintained lawn, flower beds that someone clearly took pride in. Not a single light was on in the front windows, which struck me as odd for 7:30 in the evening. Most families would be settling in for dinner or watching TV by then. Davis parked our patrol car directly in front of the house, and we both sat there for a moment, taking in the scene. The silence was unsettling. No raised voices, no sounds of conflict, nothing that would indicate the domestic dispute that had prompted the call. Even the neighboring houses seemed unusually quiet, as if the entire street was holding its breath. Davis and I exchanged glances, both of us feeling that familiar tension that comes when a call doesn't match what we expected to find. As we approached the front door, I noticed small details that made my pulse quicken. The screen door was slightly ajar, hanging at an angle that suggested it had been pushed open hastily. There were scuff marks on the white painted steps, fresh ones that hadn't been weathered by rain or time. A single red rose from the flower bed lay crushed on the walkway, its petals scattered like tiny drops of blood. Davis pointed to the front window. The curtain was pulled back just enough for someone to peek out, but it snapped shut the moment we started walking toward the porch. The air around the house felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. Every instinct I'd developed over 6 years of police work was screaming that something was very wrong here, despite the peaceful facade. When we reached the front door, Davis knocked with his standard 3 firm raps. "Police officers, we received a call about a disturbance at this address," he called out in his professional tone. The response came immediately, too immediately, as if someone had been waiting right by the door. "Just a minute," came a woman's voice, high-pitched and strained. But then we heard something that made us both tense up. A low, rumbling male voice saying something we couldn't quite make out, followed by the sound of footsteps moving quickly across what sounded like hardwood floors. The woman's voice came again, but this time it was different, still trying to sound normal, but with an edge of panic that she was clearly fighting to control. "Everything's fine out here, officers. Just give me 1 second to unlock the door." The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s with shoulder-length brown hair and kind eyes that were doing their best to appear calm. She was wearing a long-sleeved burgundy sweater despite the warm September evening, and I immediately noticed how she positioned herself to block our view into the house. "Hi, officers. I'm so sorry about the confusion. I think there might have been some kind of mistake with the call." Her smile was forced, the kind of expression someone puts on when they're trying desperately to convince others that everything is normal. But her left hand was gripping the door frame so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and there was a slight tremor in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. Behind her, the house was eerily quiet. No TV sounds, no normal household noises, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against us from the darkened hallway. Davis stepped forward slightly, his voice gentle but authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Davis and this is Officer Thompson. We're just here to check on everyone's welfare. May we come in and speak with you for a moment?" The woman's eyes darted quickly behind her, then back to us. and I caught something that made my stomach tighten. For just a split second, I saw raw fear flash across her face before she forced that fake smile back into place. "Oh, that's really not necessary. Like I said, everything's perfectly fine here. My husband and I were just having a quiet evening at home." But as she spoke, I noticed she kept glancing at something or someone behind her, and her free hand was unconsciously touching her throat in a way that suggested she was trying to hide something. The air coming from inside the house carried a strange tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. That's when I saw him, a tall figure standing in the shadows of the hallway, just barely visible from where we stood on the porch. The man was completely still, positioned in a way that he could see us but remain mostly hidden from view. What made my pulse race was the deliberate way he was standing there, like a predator watching from the darkness. The woman, later we learned her name was Christine, suddenly stepped back slightly, and I caught a glimpse of bruising on her wrist that she'd been trying to conceal with her sleeve. "Actually, officers," she said, her voice becoming even more strained, "my husband would prefer if we could handle this privately. He's not feeling well tonight." But even as she spoke, I could see the man in the hallway making some kind of gesture with his hand, a subtle movement that made Christine's entire body tense up visibly. That's when I saw him, a tall figure standing in the shadows of the hallway, just barely visible from where we stood on the porch. The man was completely still, positioned in a way that he could see us but remain mostly hidden from view. What made my pulse race was the deliberate way he was standing there, like a predator watching from the darkness. The woman, later we learned her name was Christine, suddenly stepped back slightly, and I caught a glimpse of bruising on her wrist that she'd been trying to conceal with her sleeve. "Actually, officers," she said, her voice becoming even more strained, "my husband would prefer if we could handle this privately. He's not feeling well tonight." But even as she spoke, I could see the man in the hallway making some kind of gesture with his hand, a subtle movement that made Christine's entire body tense up visibly. Davis caught my eye, and I knew he was seeing the same red flags I was. "Ma'am, we appreciate your cooperation, but we do need to complete our welfare check. It's standard procedure when we receive a call like this." As he spoke, I positioned myself so I could keep a better eye on the figure in the hallway, and what I saw next made my training kick into high gear. The man was slowly reaching towards something at his waist, not in an aggressive way, but in a way that was clearly meant to be a threat that only Christine could see. She saw it too because her breathing became shallow and rapid, and she started blinking more frequently, as if she was trying to send us some kind of message. "Please," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. He's right behind me." The way she said it, barely moving her lips, told me everything I needed to know about how dangerous this situation had become. Davis immediately shifted into crisis mode, his voice becoming calm but commanding. "Sir, could you please step into the light where we can see you? We're just here to make sure everyone's safe." The man in the hallway didn't move for several long seconds, and during that time, Christine's fear was so palpable I could practically feel it radiating from her. Then slowly he stepped forward into the dim light coming from the porch. He was about 45 years old, heavily built with cold gray eyes that seemed to calculate every movement we made. His name was Kevin, and he had the kind of presence that fills a room with menace without him having to say a word. "Officers," he said in a voice that was artificially friendly, "I'm not sure why you're here, but as my wife already told you, we're having a quiet evening. No problems here." But as he spoke, he placed his hand on Christine's shoulder in what might have appeared to be a loving gesture, except I could see his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to make her wince. Davis immediately shifted into crisis mode, his voice becoming calm but commanding. "Sir, could you please step into the light where we can see you? We're just here to make sure everyone's safe." The man in the hallway didn't move for several long seconds, and during that time, Christine's fear was so palpable, I could practically feel it radiating from her. Then, slowly, he stepped forward into the dim light coming from the porch. He was about 45 years old, heavily built with cold gray eyes that seemed to calculate every movement we made. His name was Kevin, and he had the kind of presence that fills a room with menace without him having to say a word. "Officers," he said in a voice that was artificially friendly. "I'm not sure why you're here, but as my wife already told you, we're having a quiet evening. No problems here." But as he spoke, he placed his hand on Christine's shoulder in what might have appeared to be a loving gesture, except I could see his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to make her wince. The most chilling part was how he maintained eye contact with us while simultaneously communicating threats to Christine through his grip and body language. Every few seconds, he would shift his weight or adjust his hand position, and each time he did, Christine would flinch almost imperceptibly. It was like watching a master manipulator at work, someone who had perfected the art of intimidation to such a degree that he could terrorize his victim right in front of law enforcement without appearing to do anything wrong. Davis and I both knew we were dealing with someone extremely dangerous, someone who had likely done this before and had gotten away with it. The air around us felt electric with tension, and I could sense that we were walking a razor's edge between diffusing the situation and triggering an explosion of violence that could end tragically for everyone involved. That's when Davis made a brilliant tactical decision that probably saved Christine's life. "Ma'am," he said directly to Christine, "I'd like to speak with you privately for just a moment. Standard procedure requires us to interview all parties separately." Kevin's grip on her shoulder tightened visibly, and his jaw clenched, but he couldn't openly object without appearing suspicious. "There's really no need for that," he said, his voice losing some of its artificial warmth. "We can all talk right here." But Davis was already positioning himself between Kevin and Christine, while I moved to create a barrier that would prevent Kevin from lunging forward if he decided to escalate. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back into the house while my partner speaks with your wife. This is standard protocol, and I assure you it will only take a few minutes." The tension in that moment was so thick I could barely breathe, and I could see Kevin's entire body coiling like a spring about to snap. What happened next still gives me chills when I think about it. Kevin took a step backward, but as he did, he locked eyes with Christine and slowly drew his finger across his throat, a gesture so quick and subtle that if I had blinked, I would have missed it. Christine went completely white, and her knees actually buckled slightly. That was all the confirmation we needed. Davis immediately keyed his radio and called for backup, while I positioned myself to block Kevin's path to Christine. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands visible and step further back into the house," I commanded, my hand moving instinctively toward my weapon. Kevin's mask finally slipped completely, and the cold rage in his eyes was terrifying. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled, but he complied, stepping backward into the hallway. Within minutes, backup arrived, and we were able to safely extract Christine from the house and arrest Kevin on charges of domestic violence, intimidation, and possession of an illegal firearm that we found during the search. "3 months ago, I had an experience that still haunts me every single night. Officer Jake Martinez here, Austin PD, 7 years on the force. Most of my shifts are pretty standard. Domestic disputes, traffic violations, the occasional drunk and disorderly. But that Friday night in March was different. Everything about it felt wrong from the moment I clocked in. I was assigned to the graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., patrolling the east side where the calls tend to get more unpredictable after midnight. The night air was crisp, around 68 degrees, and the streets were unusually quiet for a weekend. I remember thinking how peaceful everything seemed, how the usual chaos of downtown Austin had settled into an eerie calm. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was just finishing up paperwork from a routine traffic stop when dispatch crackled through my radio with a priority code. "Unit 47, we have a distressed individual reporting a possible kidnapping in progress. Location moving eastbound on Highway 183. The dispatcher's voice had that edge to it that made my chest tighten. I'd heard that tone before. Usually meant someone was in real trouble. I flipped on my lights and sirens, adrenaline already starting to pump through my system. As I sped toward the coordinates, I tried to imagine what I might be walking into. Kidnapping calls were rare in our district, maybe 2 or 3 a year, and they usually turned out to be custody disputes or misunderstandings. But something about this one felt different even before I arrived. When I pulled up to the gas station on East Riverside, I spotted him immediately. The rideshare driver was pacing frantically near the pumps, a thin guy in his 40s with graying hair and thick-rimmed glasses that kept sliding down his nose. His name was Carlos Mendez, and he drove for one of those app-based services to make ends meet while going to community college. The poor guy was shaking like a leaf, constantly wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool night air. His car, a beat-up silver sedan with ride-share stickers on the windows, was parked at an odd angle with the driver's door still hanging open. I could see his phone lying on the passenger seat, the app still running with some kind of trip completion screen glowing in the darkness. The moment he saw my patrol car, he rushed toward me with this desperate look in his eyes, like he'd been waiting for salvation. Carlos started talking before I even got out of my vehicle, his words tumbling over each other in a mix of English and Spanish. "Officer, please, you have to help me find him. The man with the gun. He made me follow that car for hours. I thought he was going to kill me. I swear to God, I thought I was going to die tonight." His voice was hoarse, probably from screaming or crying, and he kept glancing around like he expected someone to jump out from behind the gas pumps. I guided him to sit on the curb and pulled out my notepad, trying to calm him down enough to get a coherent statement. That's when he told me the most disturbing part of his story. About an hour earlier, he'd picked up what seemed like a normal fare from a downtown hotel. The passenger was a woman in her 30s, well-dressed, carrying a small purse and acting completely normal when she got in his car. But instead of giving him a destination, she'd pulled out a black handgun and ordered him to follow a dark blue SUV that was parked across the street. Carlos described how the woman had pressed the gun against the back of his seat, her voice calm and almost polite as she gave him directions. She wasn't screaming or acting crazy like you'd expect, he told me, his voice dropping to a whisper. She was so quiet, so controlled, that made it even more terrifying. For over an hour, she'd forced him to tail the SUV through various neighborhoods, staying exactly 3 car lengths behind. They'd driven through residential areas, past closed shopping centers, and along dark stretches of highway where the streetlights were few and far between. The whole time, she kept the gun trained on him while occasionally speaking into her phone in hushed tones. He couldn't make out what she was saying, but he noticed she had this strange accent, maybe European, and she kept checking her watch like she was timing something. The most chilling detail was how she'd tapped the barrel of the gun against his headrest whenever he got too close to the SUV or fell too far behind. The chase had ended abruptly when the SUV pulled into an abandoned strip mall parking lot near the airport. Carlos watched in his rearview mirror as the woman suddenly got out without saying a word, walked about 50 feet away, and simply vanished into the darkness between 2 buildings. He'd waited for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, before finally driving to the gas station and calling 911. When he finished his story, I noticed his rideshare app was still tracking the trip, showing an active fare that had been running for over 2 hours. The pickup location was indeed the downtown hotel he'd mentioned, but the destination showed as unknown, with GPS coordinates that kept shifting. I immediately called for backup and requested that all available units start searching for the dark blue SUV. Something about Carlos's story rang true, in a way that made my gut twist with dread. The level of detail, the specific way he described the woman's behavior, the fact that he'd driven straight to a public place and called police, none of it suggested he was lying or confused. Within 20 minutes, Officer Lisa Chen radioed in that she'd found the SUV. It was parked behind a 24-hour diner, about 3 miles from where the woman had disappeared, engine still warm but completely empty. When I arrived at the scene, the first thing that hit me was the smell, a mixture of cleaning chemicals and something metallic that made my nose burn. The SUV's windows were tinted so dark they were almost black, and the license plates turned out to be stolen from a vehicle in Dallas. but it was what we found inside that made this case take a turn toward nightmare territory. The back seat had been covered with plastic sheeting, the kind contractors use for paint jobs, and there were zip ties scattered on the floor. Most disturbing of all, we found a woman's purse wedged under the passenger seat, containing ID for someone named Amy Patterson, a 28-year-old teacher from North Austin. Her driver's license photo showed a smiling blonde woman with kind eyes and dimples. I'd never seen her before, but something about her face made my chest tighten with worry. Detective Frank Morrison arrived about an hour later, and that's when everything started connecting in the worst possible way. He took one look at Amy Patterson's ID, and his face went white as a sheet. "Martinez, we've been looking for this woman for 3 days," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was reported missing by her roommate on Monday night. Last anyone heard from her, she was leaving work at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade." The timeline was starting to paint a horrifying picture. Amy had disappeared on Monday, and here it was Friday morning, with evidence suggesting she'd been held somewhere against her will. The plastic sheeting, the zip ties, the chemical smell. It all pointed to something far worse than a simple kidnapping for ransom. Morrison showed me the missing person report, and I noticed Amy's car had been found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot the same night she vanished. Security footage from the store showed a woman matching the description Carlos had given me. Well-dressed, dark hair, European features, getting into Amy's car and driving away. The pieces were falling into place in the most terrifying way possible. Morrison explained that they'd been tracking this woman for weeks, connecting her to at least 2 other disappearances in the metro area. Her method was always the same. She'd target young professional women, somehow gain access to their vehicles, and then they'd simply vanish without a trace. The other victims were Rebecca Foster, a 26-year-old nurse, and Diana Walsh, a 31-year-old marketing executive. Both had been reported missing within the past month, and both their cars had been found abandoned in different locations around the city. What made this case so chilling was how calculated everything appeared to be. The woman wasn't acting impulsively or randomly. She was hunting with a specific pattern, and she was getting bolder with each victim. The fact that she'd forced Carlos to follow the SUV suggested she was moving Amy to a new location, possibly because her previous hiding spot had been compromised somehow. As dawn approached, we coordinated with the FBI's local task force that specialized in serial abductions. Agent Patricia Reeves arrived with a team of analysts who immediately began processing the evidence from both vehicles. What they discovered in the SUV's trunk made my skin crawl. Multiple sets of women's clothing, all neatly folded and sorted by size, along with several cell phones that had been completely wiped clean. There were also photographs, dozens of them, showing various women going about their daily routines completely unaware they were being watched. Amy Patterson's photo was among them, taken outside her school while she was loading supplies into her car. The most disturbing find was a small notebook containing what appeared to be schedules and behavioral patterns for each victim. The handwriting was neat and methodical, like someone keeping a scientific log. Each entry detailed where the women worked, their daily routines, what time they left their homes, and even personal information about their families and relationships. It was the work of someone who had been studying these women for weeks before making their move. The breakthrough came when Agent Reeves discovered GPS coordinates written in the notebook's margin, coordinates that led to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. By 7 a.m., we had the place surrounded, and what we found inside Unit 47 will haunt me for the rest of my life. Amy Patterson was alive, barely conscious but breathing, chained to a metal chair in a makeshift cell that had been constructed inside the storage unit. The space was equipped with cameras, recording equipment, and what appeared to be medical supplies. Amy was severely dehydrated and had multiple injuries, but she was coherent enough to confirm that her captor was indeed the woman Carlos had described. The other 2 victims, Rebecca and Diana, weren't as fortunate. We found evidence suggesting they had been held in the same location but moved elsewhere weeks earlier. Amy told us the woman had been planning to relocate her that night, which explained why she'd needed Carlos to follow the SUV. She'd been using the rideshare driver as an unwitting accomplice to scout the route to her new location. The woman we were hunting turned out to be Elena Kozlov, a 34-year-old former psychiatric nurse who had entered the country illegally 3 years earlier. She'd been dismissed from her job at a mental health facility in Houston for inappropriate behavior toward patients, and had apparently been living off the grid while developing her twisted obsession with controlling and documenting the lives of other women. We never caught her that night. She'd vanished into the darkness like she'd done so many times before. But Amy's rescue led to a nationwide manhunt that eventually tracked Kozlov to a motel in New Mexico 6 weeks later. She was found with detailed plans for targeting women in 3 other states, along with enough evidence to put her away for life. Carlos received a commendation for his courage in reporting the incident, and Amy made a full recovery, though she moved away from Austin shortly after the trial. As for me, I still patrol those same streets every night, but I'll never forget how close we came to losing her, and how a random rideshare driver's split-second decision to call for help saved a life and stopped a monster. I'm a police officer in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. Been on the force for about 7 years now. Most of our calls are pretty routine. Drunk and disorderly, domestic disputes, the occasional break-in. But what happened last Wednesday evening still keeps me up at night, and I can't stop thinking about it. I was working the evening shift with my partner, Officer Bradley, when we got a call that changed everything. The dispatcher's voice crackled through our radio around 9:30 p.m., saying they'd received multiple reports of a child crying somewhere inside the old Sunset Motel on Route 47. That place had been condemned for over 2 years, boarded up tight after the county finally shut it down due to constant drug activity and code violations. The building was a complete eyesore, peeling paint, broken windows covered with plywood, and a parking lot full of weeds growing through cracked asphalt. As we pulled into the empty lot, our headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated the decrepit structure. The motel was a single-story building shaped like an L, with about 20 rooms that used to house travelers back in the day before it became a haven for addicts and dealers. Bradley parked near the old office, and we both stepped out into the cool October air. The silence was immediate and unsettling. No traffic sounds, no insects, nothing but the distant hum of power lines overhead. Then we heard it. A faint crying sound, definitely a child, maybe an infant, coming from somewhere inside the building. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from the far end of the L-shaped structure. We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. How the hell did a baby get inside a boarded-up building? Bradley grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the sound while I called for backup and checked the perimeter for any signs of forced entry. The crying continued as we circled the building, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. Every door was secured with heavy boards and industrial screws, every window covered with thick plywood that looked like it hadn't been touched in months. There was no way someone could have gotten inside without leaving obvious signs of entry. The crying seemed to move around too, which made no sense. One moment it sounded like it was coming from room 14, the next from room 8. We found a maintenance door on the back side that had been pried open sometime in the past, but it was secured again with a new padlock that showed no signs of tampering. The weeds around the building were undisturbed, no footprints in the dirt, no broken glass or debris that would suggest recent activity. But that infant kept crying, and the sound was getting more desperate, more urgent. Bradley managed to find a loose board on one of the windows near where the crying seemed strongest. Room 12, according to the faded numbers still visible on the door. He pried it back just enough for us to squeeze through, and we climbed into the abandoned room with our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smell hit us immediately: mold, decay, and something else I couldn't identify. The room was completely empty except for an old mattress stained with God knows what, and chunks of plaster that had fallen from the ceiling. But the crying was definitely coming from inside the building now, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. We moved through the connecting door into room 11, then 10, following the sound as it seemed to drift from one room to the next. Each room was the same, empty, decaying, with that same horrible smell getting stronger as we went deeper into the building. The crying suddenly stopped. Just like that. Complete silence that was somehow worse than the sound itself. Bradley and I stood in room 7, our flashlight beams dancing across water-stained walls and debris-covered floors, straining to hear anything. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Then it started again, but this time it was different. The crying wasn't coming from ahead of us anymore. It was behind us, back in the direction we'd come from. We turned around and started retracing our steps, but every room we entered was exactly as we'd left it, empty, silent. Our backup arrived around 10:15, and Sergeant Collins brought 2 more officers and a K9 unit. The dog, a German Shepherd named Rex, immediately started acting strange the moment we let him into the building. He whined, pulled against his leash, and refused to go past room 9. His handler, Officer Martinez, said he'd never seen Rex act like that before. We split up and conducted a systematic search of the entire building. 6 officers, 1 dog, and industrial-grade flashlights, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. The crying continued intermittently, sometimes so faint you had to hold your breath to hear it, other times loud enough that it seemed to come from the walls themselves. Room 4 was where it seemed strongest, so we focused our search there. The room was identical to all the others. Bare walls, broken fixtures, that same overwhelming smell of decay. But there was something else in that room, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature was noticeably colder, and there was a feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake off. We tore that room apart looking for any explanation. Loose floorboards, hidden compartments, anything that might house a child or even a recording device. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the crying kept coming from somewhere inside those walls. Around midnight, we called in the fire department to help us check for any structural issues that might explain the sounds. Chief Williams brought his thermal imaging camera, thinking maybe there was a heating system still running, or some kind of ventilation that could carry sounds from outside. The thermal scan showed the building was completely cold. No heat signatures, no electrical activity, nothing. The power had been cut off for over 2 years, and there was no gas line connected to the property. But when we pointed that thermal camera toward room 4, something bizarre showed up on the screen. There was a small, warm spot about 3 feet off the ground, roughly the size of a child, moving slowly back and forth near the far wall. Williams checked the camera 3 times, thinking it was malfunctioning. But every scan showed the same thing: heat where there shouldn't be any, in the shape of something that looked disturbingly human. We stared at that wall for 20 minutes, and the crying continued, sometimes in perfect sync with the movement of that warm spot on the screen. The search officially ended at 2 a.m. when Sergeant Collins declared the building empty and secure. We'd found absolutely nothing. No child, no recording device, no logical explanation for the sounds we'd all heard. But I couldn't let it go. The next morning I went to City Hall and pulled the records for the Sunset Motel. What I found in those files made my skin crawl. 3 years ago, Child Protective Services had responded to a domestic violence call in room 4. The same room where the crying had been strongest. A young mother named Crystal had been beaten unconscious by her boyfriend, and they'd found a 6-month-old baby girl in the room, malnourished and showing signs of severe neglect. The infant, named Hope, had been removed from the home and placed in emergency foster care. According to the follow-up reports, little Hope had died just 2 weeks later from complications related to failure to thrive and the abuse she'd suffered. The case had been closed, the boyfriend had served 18 months for assault, and Crystal had disappeared from the system entirely. I couldn't stop thinking about that little girl, Hope. 6 months old, died alone in a foster home after being rescued from room 4 of the Sunset Motel. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. I spent the rest of that Friday researching everything I could about the case, reading police reports, CPS files, even the coroner's report. Hope had died on a Monday night in November, 3 years ago. The Foster family said she'd been crying inconsolably for hours before she finally stopped breathing. They'd tried everything, feeding her, changing her, rocking her, but nothing worked. The autopsy showed she'd suffered from severe malnutrition and had developmental delays consistent with long-term neglect. But what really got to me was a note in the CPS file from the caseworker who'd initially responded to the motel. She'd written that Hope had been found in a makeshift crib made from a dresser drawer, crying so loudly that neighbors in adjacent rooms had complained. The crying had been so distinctive, so heartbreaking, that the caseworker said she'd never forgotten it. That Saturday, I decided to go back to the motel alone. I told myself I was just being thorough, following up on the case, but honestly, I needed to know if I was losing my mind. I parked in the same spot we'd used during the search and sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the building. It was about 4 p.m., broad daylight, and everything looked normal. Just an abandoned building with boarded windows and overgrown weeds. I walked around the perimeter one more time, checking for any signs that someone might have accessed the building since our search. Nothing had changed. The boards were still secure, the padlock on the maintenance door was still intact, and there were no new footprints or disturbances around the building. But as I stood near room 4, I heard it again. Faint, but unmistakable. The crying of an infant coming from inside the building. This time I didn't hesitate. I pried open the same loose board Bradley had found and climbed back into room 12. The crying was louder now, more desperate, and it was definitely coming from room 4. I made my way through the connecting doors, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the debris-covered floors. Room 4 felt different in the daylight filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows. I could see details I'd missed during our nighttime search. Water stains on the walls that looked almost like fingerprints, scratch marks on the floor near where a bed would have been, and in the corner, a small indentation in the wall about 3 feet off the ground, roughly the size of a dresser drawer. The crying was coming from that exact spot, so clear and heartbreaking that I actually found myself looking around for a baby to comfort. I knelt down and placed my hand on the wall where the indentation was, and the crying stopped immediately. The silence was deafening, but there was something else now, a feeling of peace, of relief, that I can't really explain. I stayed there for almost an hour, just sitting in that empty room, and the crying never started again. I've been back to the motel twice since then, and it's been completely silent both times. No crying, no strange sounds, nothing. Last week, I heard through the grapevine that the city council finally approved the demolition permit for the building. They're tearing it down next month to make room for a new shopping center. I don't know if what I experienced was real or just my mind playing tricks on me, but I like to think that little Hope somehow found her way back to the only place she'd ever known as home. Maybe she was looking for her mother, or maybe she was just scared and alone and needed someone to acknowledge that she'd existed. I'll never know for sure, but I sleep better at night knowing that the crying has stopped. Sometimes I drive by the motel on my way home from work, and I say a little prayer for Hope. She deserved so much better than what life gave her, and I hope wherever she is now, she's finally at peace. I used to be a sheriff's deputy in a quiet county up in northern Wisconsin. The kind of place where you know half the people by name and the rest by their pickup trucks. Back then, I worked nights mostly, patrolling the back roads and doing wellness checks on older residents who still used landlines. It wasn't an exciting job, and that was the point. I'd transferred from Milwaukee a couple years earlier to get away from the noise, both literal and otherwise. That night in particular was meant to be slow. I had a thermos of gas station coffee in the console, classic rock playing low on the radio, and I was going to park by Lake Mayfield to wait out the shift. That plan didn't last long. Around 9:15 p.m., dispatch came through with a report of a missing teenager near Red Hollow Campground. A girl named Kayla Monroe, 17, had been camping with her boyfriend and a few other kids from a nearby town. According to the call, she'd stormed off after an argument earlier that evening, and nobody had seen her since. Her boyfriend waited almost 2 hours before calling it in. My partner that night was Deputy Eli Granger, a guy originally from Kentucky with a heavy drawl and a calm temperament that didn't crack under pressure. We met up at the ranger station near the trailhead, went over the basics, and grabbed flashlights before heading in. The campground itself was small, 10 or so sites arranged in a loop, mostly empty on a weeknight. There was a fire still going in one of the pits, and a couple of the teens were sitting around it, pale and anxious. The boyfriend, a wiry kid named Seth with a busted lip and red hoodie, claimed Kayla had just wanted to cool off, but it had been 3 hours. No phone, no flashlight, and she'd gone barefoot. The air had that dense chill it gets after sunset out there, and walking off into the trees without shoes didn't make sense unless something was really wrong. Eli and I split up at first, staying within shouting distance, calling her name and scanning the dark edges of the woods with our beams. Nothing, just the crunch of our boots on dried pine needles and the occasional flicker of a raccoon's eyes reflecting in the dark. We kept moving deeper, maybe a quarter mile from the campground, when I heard it for the first time. What sounded like a girl crying. It wasn't close, maybe 100 yards off to my left, and it was soft, broken by sharp gasps like someone trying to keep it together while calling out. I stopped and shouted her name, but the sound cut off instantly, like someone had hit mute. Eli caught up to me, said he'd heard the same thing from a different direction just before I did. We exchanged a look. He didn't say anything, but the way his jaw tightened told me we were both thinking the same thing. Either we were dealing with a scared kid running in circles, or someone wanted us to think that. We kept pushing forward, but now with more caution. The woods were getting denser, branches closing in overhead, and the kind of silence that doesn't feel natural had started to settle around us. Not quiet, just intentional. Every step forward felt like stepping into someone else's territory, like we weren't supposed to be there. Eli kept glancing behind us, and I noticed he'd turned down the volume on his radio. Neither of us wanted to break whatever weird stillness we'd walked into. We called her name a few more times, pausing to listen. Nothing. Then, just as we were about to turn back and regroup, the crying started again. This time ahead of us, clearer, closer. It sounded different now. Still like a girl, but something about the rhythm was wrong, too steady, like it was being repeated. Eli looked at me and whispered, "That doesn't sound right." I agreed. We angled our flashlights toward the direction of the sound and moved in slowly, about 10, maybe 15 yards when I noticed something odd. Broken branches forming what looked like a trail, but too clean, like someone had made sure we'd see it. And every 10 feet or so, another sound, a dry sob, a sniff, followed by silence. It wasn't random. It was leading us somewhere, and I didn't like how easily we were following it. I stopped and radioed in our location just in case. Dispatch came back scratchy, like we were getting interference, but the message went through. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. We kept following the trail, flashlights sweeping side to side. Then Eli grabbed my arm, tight, and pointed at something up ahead. It was a hoodie, bright red, hanging off a low tree branch. Seth's hoodie. Or an identical one, Eli muttered. She didn't have this on when she left. That's when I realized we hadn't heard a single animal for over 15 minutes. Not a single rustle, not even bugs. Just that occasional cry, always ahead, always vanishing the moment we got too close. I wanted to turn around right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me, telling me this was wrong, not natural. But Eli was already moving forward, light trained on the hoodie. I followed, slower. The ground had changed, muddier, soft in places where it shouldn't be, like the forest floor had been dug up recently and badly covered again. We reached the tree with the hoodie, and that's when the cry came again. Louder this time, maybe 20 feet ahead. But now it wasn't just crying. There was laughter behind it. Quiet, broken laughter like someone trying to keep it in but failing. I looked at Eli, and he had his hand near his holster. That's all I needed to see. We moved slowly now, shoulder to shoulder. The beam of my flashlight caught something up ahead between the trees. A figure, low to the ground, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat. Eli raised his light, and for a second, we both thought it was her. Long brown hair, head tilted down, knees drawn up like she was hugging herself. "Kayla?" Eli called out, voice calm but firm. No answer, not even a flinch. We stepped closer and my foot hit something hard in the dirt. Another shoe. This one looked old, mud-caked, torn, not something a teenager would wear. Eli crouched to get a better look at the figure, and that's when it stood up. It didn't bolt, it didn't scream. It just stood, slow and mechanical. And it wasn't her. It was taller, the face half hidden by the long hair, and the mouth, God, the mouth, was twisted in a wide, unnatural grin like it had been carved into the skin, not moving, just stretched. We both stepped back at the same time, and Eli barked something, either a warning or a command, I'm not sure. The thing tilted its head like it was listening, then turned and vanished into the trees in 2 strides. Just gone. No snapping branches, no crunching leaves, just silence again. We didn't chase it, not even for a second. Instead, we turned around and booked it back toward the campground, retracing our steps as fast as we could without completely losing our footing. The red hoodie was gone when we passed that tree again, so were the broken branches. It was like someone had cleaned up behind us. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, Eli was white as a sheet, and I had that electric tension running up my spine, like I'd just walked through a live wire. We didn't talk much, just radioed in, made our report. Kayla was found the next morning, walking along a service road 5 miles south, barefoot, shivering, and unable to speak. She's never told anyone what happened in the woods that night. I still think about that figure, the way it moved, the way it smiled, or whatever that expression was supposed to be. I've worked scenes that haunt me, ones that don't go away even years later, but that thing in the woods, it wasn't just someone playing games. It wanted us to follow it, wanted us deep enough where nobody could hear us if we screamed. We were lucky. That's the truth. If we'd kept going, I don't think either of us would have made it back. And the worst part? I still hear that same cry sometimes when I walk the woods behind my property. Always distant, always fading the second I try to find it. I'd only been in Atlanta for about 7 months when all of this happened. I was 23, had just left community college in Savannah, and landed a job as a hostess at a well-known Southern grill downtown. It wasn't exactly where I imagined myself career-wise, but the pay was decent. The team seemed friendly enough, and I finally had my own place, a tiny studio on the east side, above a hair salon that closed early every day. My life was pretty quiet. I worked late shifts, walked home most nights with headphones in, and spent weekends catching up on shows or visiting my cousin across town. At that point, the worst thing that had happened to me on the job was some drunk guy throwing up on the sidewalk. The restaurant was always buzzing, especially during dinner rush on weekends. We were one of those modern rustic places, reclaimed wood on the walls, Edison bulbs, mason jar cocktails. It attracted a very specific crowd, local professionals trying to seem laid back, tourists who saw us on TikTok, and of course, the occasional creeps. The staff was used to it. We had code words for weird customers, backup from kitchen staff if someone got too handsy. And the general rule was don't walk to your car alone after midnight. It wasn't paranoia, just routine. So, when I started getting weird messages on Instagram, I assumed it was just one of those customers being gross again. Probably someone who saw my name on the receipt and looked me up. At first, the messages were vague. Stuff like, "You looked so pretty in that dress tonight," or, "I saw you laughing with that bartender, guess I'm not enough for you." Creepy, sure, but easy enough to block. I didn't think much of it, and honestly, I'd dealt with worse online before. But then the tone changed. Whoever it was started referencing things they shouldn't know, like what time I left work, what kind of sandwich I always ordered on my break, even what color my umbrella was when I walked home in the rain. That one stopped me cold. It had rained hard the night before, and I remembered standing under the awning outside the restaurant waiting for the downpour to let up. I'd been alone, or at least I thought I had. I told my manager about it the next day. Her name was Tasha, mid-30s, sharp as hell, didn't take crap from anyone. She took me seriously right away and said she'd talk to corporate and pull the security footage. That made me feel better for a while. But the messages didn't stop. They got nastier, more aggressive. And the worst part? The account kept changing. Every time I blocked one, another popped up. Same writing style, same fixation on details. At some point, I stopped checking my phone during shifts because I couldn't handle the anxiety of seeing another notification pop up with something like, "Blue sneakers today? Cute. You always walk faster when you're scared." After a week of that, Tasha pushed me to file a police report. I was hesitant at first. I mean, what were they really going to do about some anonymous messages? But she insisted, and I ended up talking to a detective named Alton Shaw. He looked more like a high school football coach than a cop. Stocky build, buzz cut, slightly crooked nose. But he had this way of listening that made you feel like you weren't being dramatic. He asked good questions too, like if I'd noticed anyone hanging around after hours, or if there was a recent conflict with anyone at work. That's when something clicked, and I mentioned Nate. Nate had been a line cook. Quiet guy, mid-20s, never caused problems that I knew of. But he gave me weird vibes. Not in a loud, obvious way, but the kind where he'd linger a little too long if I was laughing with a coworker, or say things under his breath like, "I liked your hair better the other way," when I hadn't even spoken to him that shift. He got fired about a month before the messages started. Apparently, he'd been caught sneaking beers from the back cooler and mouthing off to the sous chef. Nothing violent, just unstable. I hadn't really thought about him since he left. But when I said his name, Detective Shaw paused and wrote it down slowly like it rang a bell. A few days later, Shaw called me and asked if I could come down to the station. He'd spoken to a few people from the restaurant, mostly waitstaff, and one of them, a guy named Devin, mentioned that Nate had once followed me out after a shift. That stopped me in my tracks. I asked Devin why he never told me, and he said he didn't think it was serious at the time, just figured Nate lived in the same direction. But looking back, he said Nate stayed on the opposite side of town. It didn't make sense. Shaw said they were trying to get a subpoena for Nate's online activity, but that could take time. Meanwhile, I should change my routine, stay with someone if I could. I nodded along but didn't tell him I lived alone. That night, I crashed at my cousin Zoe's apartment. She lived in a busier part of town, 3rd floor, building with a keypad lock. I didn't sleep much though. Around 3 a.m., I got a DM from a new account. No profile picture, no posts, just one message. "Don't think your cousin's place is safer." That was the first time I really panicked. My chest got tight and my mouth went dry. I walked to the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside on the sidewalk. Nothing. Just streetlights, parked cars, the occasional blur of a late-night jogger. But I knew then, whoever it was, they weren't guessing anymore. They were watching. The next morning, I called Detective Shaw from Zoe's bathroom, whispering like the walls could hear me. He didn't say much at first, just told me to hang tight and not go anywhere alone. Then he added something that made my stomach drop in a different way. They'd pulled a recent incident report from a diner across town, where Nate had apparently been arrested 2 weeks earlier for loitering and refusing to leave a female employee alone. He'd listed no fixed address. Shaw said he might be sleeping in his car or couch hopping, which made tracking him down tricky. But then he said they were putting in for a protective order and would send a patrol car to swing by my place that night. It helped a little, just knowing someone would be nearby. That same evening, while I was still at Zoe's, Tasha texted me a photo. It was grainy, pulled from our security camera, It showed someone standing across the street from the restaurant's back exit, just out of the reach of the parking lot lights. You could barely make out the shape, but the posture felt familiar. I zoomed in and my stomach clenched. Baggy hoodie, hands in pockets, tilted head, like he was just waiting. Tasha said she only found it after checking the cameras going back a few nights. It wasn't from that day. It was from 2 weeks ago. 2 nights later, I went back to my apartment just to grab some stuff. Shaw had told me to call him before going back, so he arranged for an officer to meet me there. His name was Officer Lang, and he was friendly but kept one hand near his radio the whole time. We didn't see anything unusual, and I rushed through packing a duffel bag. But when I stepped into my tiny kitchen, I noticed something that made my scalp prickle. My dish towel was on the floor. I always hung it on the oven handle, always. Lang checked the windows, the door, everything was locked. No sign of forced entry, but I knew that towel hadn't just fallen. Not with the way it was folded in half like someone had picked it up and dropped it. I left without another word. A week later, they found Nate sleeping in an abandoned sedan 3 blocks from my job. Inside the car, they discovered a spiral notebook filled with what Shaw later described as disturbingly organized notes. My schedule, Zoe's address, even a sketch of my apartment layout. The messages stopped after that. No trial, just a psych hold and eventually charges. I've moved since then. New number, new place, new job. But I still catch myself looking over my shoulder on late shifts. I guess I don't fully believe it's over. Not really. It started while I was digging through surveillance footage for a completely unrelated case, a convenience store robbery from 3 years ago that had gone cold. I work out of a precinct in Michigan, a town that sits somewhere between quiet and forgettable. Nothing happens here that makes headlines, and that's exactly what I used to like about it. My name's Officer Sean Whitaker, and at the time, I'd been in the force just shy of 12 years. I was doing one of those long, tedious reviews of archived footage, trying to piece together a timeline, when I saw her, just for a few seconds. A woman standing in the far hallway near the filing room, almost tucked out of frame. I paused, rewound, zoomed in. She didn't fit. Not in that space. Not with the timestamp. At first I chalked it up to a civilian who'd wandered in, maybe dropped off some documents, maybe a witness. Happens now and then. But what caught my attention was how she just stood there, staring toward the door that leads to our oldest storage files. She wasn't moving, not talking to anyone, just waiting. Dark jacket, long brown hair, expression unreadable, almost blurred like the camera couldn't quite focus on her face. The odd thing was there was no log of any civilian visitor that day. We have to keep a log, even for people dropping off a report. I asked Janet at the front desk if she remembered anyone like that, but she just gave me a look and shook her head. Said there hadn't been any walk-ins that entire week. That should have been it, but I don't let go of things that easily. I went back through more footage. Same month, same hallway, different angle. And damn if she wasn't there again. This time, she was near the exit by the side lot, standing so still, she looked like a cutout pasted onto the video. No one else noticed her. None of the officers passing by seemed to interact with her. I paused the footage right there and called over Malcolm, one of the detectives who'd been on the force even longer than me. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then said something I'll never forget. She looks familiar. He couldn't place it though, and neither could I. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen her before too. Not in the way people look familiar because they resemble someone. This was deeper, like a face I'd passed in a hallway without realizing it. So I started pulling older tapes, not just from that year, but from years prior, cases long since filed away. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for anymore. Obsession might be a strong word, but that's what it became, because she kept showing up, always in the same 2 places, just outside the filing room or near an exit, never interacting, never acknowledged, like she wasn't supposed to be there but somehow always was. The further back I went, the more she appeared. Not in every tape, but often enough that it stopped being coincidence. One from the spring of 2015 showed her standing just past the old vending machines, barely lit by the flicker of a hallway bulb. Another from the winter of 2013 had her near the evidence room, her face partially obscured by shadow, but unmistakably her. Same posture, same clothes, same dead gaze. I printed stills from each clip and pinned them to a corkboard in my office, hoping to find some variation, something that proved this wasn't what it was starting to feel like. But she never aged. Her hair, her clothes, her face, they never changed. Over nearly a decade's worth of footage, she stayed the same. Eventually, I started digging into case files. If the cameras caught her, maybe the paperwork did too. I ran a facial match through our system, came up with nothing, no priors, no witness logs. But when I started pulling up older cases stored in physical form, ones that hadn't been digitized yet, I began to find her name. Not always the same name, but always attached to her face. Unidentified woman seen near scene. Possible bystander did not respond to questioning. No contact info not listed in report. She was in background statements, scribbled down like an afterthought. And every time it was in cases where something inexplicably stalled, where suspects walked, evidence went missing, leads dried up overnight. The kind of cases that made veteran officers shrug and say, just one of those things. I brought it up during a shift meeting, just casually, like I wasn't already 10 steps down the rabbit hole. I asked if anyone remembered a woman matching her description ever hanging around the station. Got a couple chuckles. One guy said, "What, you got a secret admirer?" But no one recognized her, not a single soul. Not even the older guys who'd worked cases with her in the margins. I tried showing the stills. Some looked confused, some curious. One or two looked uncomfortable, but none had a name for her. One of the newer recruits, Riley, asked me quietly afterward if I was pulling a prank. I told him I wasn't. He stopped talking to me much after that. The only person who didn't dismiss it right away was Captain Brenner. He took the stills from me without saying much, and said he'd look into it. I figured that meant he was just humoring me. But 2 days later, he called me into his office and shut the door behind me. He held up one of the photos, the one where she was near the back hallway during a power outage from years ago, and said, "Where did you find this?" I explained everything. He didn't say a word until I finished. Then he pulled a drawer open and showed me a report I'd never seen, dated over 15 years ago. A different precinct, but same layout, same hallway. And there she was, caught in the background of a grainy still. "We had a guy just like you back then," he said. He went digging too. That last conversation with Captain Brenner stuck with me. I asked what happened to the officer from the other precinct, the one who went digging. He hesitated, then just said, he quit. Said he couldn't sleep anymore. I pressed for more, but Brenner wouldn't budge. He kept the file and told me to let it be. I didn't. That night I stayed after hours and started watching more footage. Everything from the last 6 months, even the stuff that had already been reviewed. And I noticed something I hadn't picked up before. She wasn't just near exits or filing cabinets. She was always facing the door to Archive B, the room where we store case files that were never closed. That room doesn't get much foot traffic. It's basically a graveyard for forgotten work. And she never blinked in those videos. Not once. It messed with my head. I stopped eating right, stopped going home on time. My wife said I looked pale, that I jumped every time the phone rang. I started locking the filing room every night, double-checking the security codes even though no one else seemed to care. One night, I went to the station around midnight. Told myself I was going to prove she wasn't real, that it was just corrupted footage or someone playing a long prank. I pulled the tape from that evening's hallway cam and skipped forward. At 11:52 p.m., she appeared again, standing directly in front of Archive B. But this time, her head turned slowly toward the camera. Her face was still, expressionless. And then she took a single step forward. The feed cut out for 6 seconds. When it came back, she was gone. I went to check the physical hallway, heart pounding like I'd just sprinted across the lot. Nothing. Lights flickered once, but held. I unlocked Archive B, flipped the switch. Empty. Dust hanging in the air like it hadn't been disturbed in months. But on the far wall, where the last row of cabinets stood, someone had slid a single file halfway out. The label had no name, just a date and the word incomplete. Inside were copies of witness reports from a missing persons case that never made it past intake. One of the pages had handwriting I didn't recognize, tight and deliberate, almost like calligraphy. It said, "She is where things are forgotten." No initials, no context, just that. The next morning, I handed in a request to be transferred to desk duty. I couldn't keep doing it. I still work the job, but I don't go near Archive B. And I don't check old footage anymore. Captain Brenner never brought her up again, and neither did I. But sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light hits the hallway monitors just right, I swear I see movement, just at the edge of the screen. And I've made peace with not knowing. Whoever she is, she doesn't want to be found, and I've stopped looking.